Hello and welcome. For this video today we are looking at the heart and circulation, and I've got a picture of a heart over here on the left hand side, and the main job of the heart is to pump blood around the body. Now blood is a very important substance because it transports everything you need to all the different cells in your body, and the heart is very well designed in order to do that. Now we have here some blood vessels going to and from the heart, and we're going to look at a simplified version of that in a minute, but what I want to focus on for the moment is the fact that we've got a lot of muscle in the walls of the heart, and you can imagine that's important because it needs to be pumping 24/7 throughout your whole lifetime, so that muscle is very important. But also supplying that muscle is some blood vessels, and these blood vessels have a special name. The red ones here are the coronary arteries, and they have a very important job because they supply the heart itself with the blood that it needs, which contains the sugars and the oxygen which give it the fuel in order to keep on pumping. And if we ever have a problem with these coronary arteries, then this can lead to a heart attack. And when we talk about heart disease or coronary heart disease, we are talking about the blood vessels that are covering the heart as shown here, not these big major blood vessels that are going to and from the heart. It's these blood vessels around the side, and people often think it's actually the big ones here, but it's not. It's the coronary arteries that supply the fuel the heart needs to keep on pumping. Now sometimes we can have heart disease which causes blockages in these coronary arteries, and if you look at what a blocked artery might look like, this is just a cross-sectional view. So what I've got here is the walls of the artery, and you can see this yellowy substance could be cholesterol. And you can see the cholesterol has narrowed the artery greatly. That means less blood can flow, that means less sugars or glucose and oxygen can be supplied to the heart muscle, and that can be, as you imagine, quite dangerous. Now what scientists have developed is a little device called a stent, and a stent is something that's used to actually open up that blood vessel. It's like a little wire mesh in the shape of a tube, and if you look at what it can do, you can insert it into the artery, you can open it up, and it causes the artery to be slightly wider, in fact much wider than it was before, and that can restore the blood flow going to the heart, and that can help it work much better than if the arteries were blocked. So this is a fairly accurate picture of what the heart might look like, but when we're trying to label it as such, it can be a little bit confusing. What we're going to do is just going to simplify it a little bit. So here's my version of the heart. We've got the blood vessels going to and coming away from the heart. We've got their coronary arteries on the surface, but what we're interested is what's actually going on inside, and there's a simplified version of what the heart looks like on the inside. Now there are a couple of labels that you need to know for this, and they are as follows. We've got, firstly, before we actually talk about anything else, we've got the right side of the heart, which is your left as you're looking at it. It's very important that you get this the right way around. The reason why we have this side as the right is because we're talking about a person as they're looking at their heart themselves. So if you're looking at your own heart, this is the right side and this is the left side. Okay, so you must make sure you get that the right way round. Now there are only two key words that you really need to know along with right and left, and those are atrium and ventricle. So over this side we've got the right atrium, and that's the top chamber of the heart here. We've got another atrium on the other side, and we call that the left atrium, and on the bottom we've got the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So we've got four chambers, two atria, the plural for atrium is atria, and two ventricles, and it's just important that you get the right and the left the right way around. There are a couple of extra labels that we need to add onto here in terms of the blood vessels, but we'll do that in a minute. Now the next thing I want to do is actually look at how the heart actually pumps the blood. We've got a sequence of events that we need to be fairly clear about, and let's just go through that now. So the first thing is that we have, the first step we could say is that the atria fill up. So we've got blood coming from different parts of the body, and the two chambers at the top, the atria, they fill up, and once they've filled up we have the next stage, which is the atria contract and force blood into the ventricles. So these two atria at the top will contract, the blood will be forced downwards into the ventricles, and these ventricles will then fill up. Now the next stage then is that the ventricles contract and force the blood out. So these two ventricles at the bottom at the same time will contract, and the blood will then flow out of these major blood vessels to various parts of the body. The last thing to remember about this cycle really is that there are valves in the heart that make sure the blood flows in the right direction. So when these two ventricles contract, and they do contract very hard, the blood potentially could go back up into the atria. Now we don't want that to happen, so what we've got here is some valves, and a valve is like a trapdoor, it's like a one-way door. So it would be allow blood to flow in this direction, but as soon as blood tries to flow back the other way, the valve shuts and the blood cannot therefore flow back into or flow backwards, and it has to flow or is forced out of the major blood vessels there. There are valves in other places as well, so for example in these major blood vessels that are leaving, so that blood doesn't flow back in when the muscle contracts after pushing out. And when we hear the heartbeat, what we're actually listening to are these valves opening and closing. So you can imagine the force with which these valves are opened and closed. Now the next thing I want to go through is a couple of extra labels on the heart, and we're going to talk about the circulation and look at these blood vessels in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is you do need to know the names of the major blood vessels that are to do with the heart, and the first one over here we have is the pulmonary artery. We have another one called the vena cava here. Right here is something that we call the aorta, which is an artery, and here we have the pulmonary vein. I tend to remember this by remembering the word pulmonary, and this is usually to do with the lungs, and this is representing the lungs here. So we've got a pulmonary artery going to the lungs and the pulmonary vein coming away, and the other one unfortunately you just got to remember vena cava and aorta. Now what you might notice here is that we have two distinct different circulation systems, and we do call the circulation system in the body a double circulation. We've got a route that goes from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart again, and then we've got another route that goes from the heart, this represents all the rest of the body, and then back to the heart again. So we call it a double circulation. There are two separate circulation systems that feed the lungs and feed the body. Now you may have also noticed that some of these blood vessels I've done in blue and some in this pinky colour, and you often see that in textbooks, but the reason for that is that we can see that once the blood has been to the body, it has unloaded all its oxygen, or the majority of its oxygen, and it's given it up to the cells, and therefore the blood that comes back is lacking in oxygen, so it needs to get back to the heart. It goes back to the heart, gets pumped up to the lungs where it picks up some more oxygen, and then goes back to the heart to get an extra push, to get a big push so it can go around the body. We call this blood here we call this blood here oxygenated, because it's carrying oxygen, and the blood over this side we call deoxygenated, meaning that it's got much lower levels of oxygen in it. So if you see colours on a diagram somewhere, you'll know that's what it's all about. Now what we also have are these two structures called the arteries and the veins, and you should be aware of the difference between the two. So if I was to look at an artery, so let's just take part from over here, say we cut that in half and we look at what it looks like. That's an artery. If we look in a bit more detail, you can see that it's quite thick walled, so we've got a layer of muscle. Oops, wrong pen. We've got a layer of muscle, which is in this kind of orangey colour, and a layer of this elastic tissue. And these two layers make a very thick wall, and there's a reason why the artery wall has to be so thick, because when the blood pumps out of here, there is a lot of pressure, the blood is under a lot of pressure, so the thick wall is there to help withstand that pressure, and the muscle in the wall also helps to contract and helps to pump blood around the body as well. So one clue as to when you're looking at a blood vessel, whether it's an artery or not, is one, the fact that it tends to be usually roundish in its shape, and it tends to have a very thick wall. If we were to go over to the other side and look at what a vein looks like, well, you can see two differences straight away. Firstly, the wall is not so thick. We've got a much thinner layer of muscle and elastic tissue, and it tends to be less round in its shape, and that's because of the thin wall. It's much more easily squashed. So if you're identifying the difference between an artery and a vein. The two clues are the thickness of the wall and the actual shape of it, and that should help you to tell the difference between the two. Now the last type of blood vessel we want to look at is down here. I've drawn it in slightly more detail here, and these are the capillaries. So if I just move this up here, there's a bit more space. So what we have here are the capillaries, and the capillaries is spelt with one P and two L's, but these are very, very narrow blood vessels, and they are very thin-walled blood vessels. And the reason why they're so narrow is so that they can penetrate deep into the tissues and get very, very close to the cells. So you can see here that here are the cells in the body, and these narrow capillaries are actually going in between groups of cells in order for them to be able to supply oxygen to the cells, food substances, and carry away any waste materials that the cells produce. And you could get an indication of how thin they are. These are little red blood cells that I've drawn, single cells, and you can see the capillaries are just about wide enough for these blood vessels to these blood cells to move through. So that gives you an indication of how thin they are. But really, these blood vessels, these capillaries, flow very closely to cells, and they can then drop off things like amino acids or glucose or oxygen, and pick up other stuff like waste materials, urea, carbon dioxide, that sort of stuff, and carry it away. Okay, so this is an overview of the whole circulation system, or the circulation system as a whole. These are the key points that you need to know about, and there's lots here I suppose to learn and make notes on, but worth going over once or twice just to make sure you've got it. That's me done for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.